Welcome everyone to our panel discussion on embedded security here on the Critical Lowdown. Today I'm delighted to be joined by two experts, Malcolm Kitchen, Global Security Specialist and FAE here at EPS Global, and Shawn Prestridge, US Field Applications Engineer Team Leader at IAR Systems. They're going to help us to understand the evolving security landscape for connected devices and explore practical approaches to implementing security from manufacturing through to deployment. So let's begin by looking at why this topic has become so urgent in recent years. So embedded devices have complex manufacturing processes pulling together components from a variety of sources with multiple touch points and often through different environments that make them particularly vulnerable to supply chain attacks. Shawn, can you talk a bit about what the common attack vectors are, please?
Sure. Some of the things that we've seen, especially in recent times, is supply chain manipulation, where someone hijacks a particular component that is needed to manufacture a device and it replaces it with a compromised component. Sometimes this is done very deliberately in terms of to compromise the device. In other cases, it could be that your contract manufacturer isn't exactly on the up and up, and they find a device that's on the gray market that they can get for much cheaper and therefore pad their pocketbook. So there's a lot of reasons why someone would want to do that, but other things that people look at are firmware injection. Can I make this device do something completely different? And when you look at hackers that do this, a lot of times they just do it just to see that they can and to get street cred amongst other hackers. But occasionally they're actually trying to push an agenda, or they're trying to earn quick and dirty money off of it. Counterfeit, gray market goods, that's a huge problem that we've helped some customers tackle. In one particular instance, a customer had a device that was available in the Asian market before it was available in the US and UK. And the funny thing was, it was never intended to be part of the Asian market. It was only intended to be sold in the US and UK. So that's one thing. Exploits in third-party libraries that you may be pulling in. That's a common fact of life. That's why people are building SBOMs, the software bill of materials, to be able to check those for CVEs. And a lesser thing that you see sometimes is compromised manufacturing tools, where programming heads might actually be compromised. So you don't see that quite as much, but there's so many different attack vectors, as you said, that it has become kind of a nightmare for people trying to produce and to anticipate the things that could happen and designing safeguards around this. So that's kind of where we are in today's landscape.
And presumably there's lots of consequences of these attacks. You know, can you run through some of those, please?
Yeah, sure. So one of the more common things that we see today is ransomware attacks, where a device basically becomes unavailable, or the data that has been collected in a database is now unavailable until you pay some sort of ransom to be able to get a decryption key. Device takeovers have also become very common. So in a device takeover, a hacker is essentially repurposing this device for their own ends. So I've seen cases where on hacking forums you can get IoT connected devices that basically act as VPN endpoints for you. So if you want to bypass geo restrictions on Netflix, you could use it for something as simple as that. In other cases, it could be much more nefarious, where you're using a private IoT device in order to mask the fact that you're actively attacking a nation state or a military from a nation state. So there's lots of reasons why that could be done. Disrupting operations because a particular person or group of people has a beef with a company and they want to try to cause them operational harm or money. Espionage is another big thing. We've seen where the Pegasus software has been exploited in order to be able to spy on either journalists or potentially enemies to the political landscape of a certain country. So that's another attack vector that we've seen. And finally, botnet creation. So doing a distributed denial of service through compromised devices, and it can be activated at any point. So there's lots of different reasons and attack vectors that people would want to do, but it all basically it stems from the fact that the devices aren't really securely authenticated. And I think that's really what we're talking about here is how do we prevent these things from happening? And the great news is that there are some simple steps that you can take to really push the level of security that your embedded devices have.
Amazing, Shawn. Thanks. Have you any examples of these supply chain attacks?
Well, some of the ones that we've seen are Stuxnet is a great supply chain attack. How did Stuxnet get into Iranian nuclear facilities at Natanz? And there's a lot of speculation around this because most people believe that this was done by nation state actors because of the amount of effort that goes into it. SolarWinds was another great example where a malformed update that slipstreamed in a backdoor, which was also performed by a nation state actor, Supermicro, had some issues where there were parts and components that were going in. So there's many different examples of where this type of thing has happened. And but the really scary thing is these are the ones you've heard of. So if you take a step back, you realize there's probably a bunch more that you've never heard of because they're still actively ongoing. And the best ones are the ones you never hear of. So but as I mentioned, there are some things that you can do with security to try to prevent this. And while you have to realize that security is a cat and mouse game, it's security, as I like to say, it's not a destination, it's a journey. And as soon as you up your security game, guess what? The hackers are going to up their cryptanalysis game or the way that they use to break into systems. But you can make it much harder on them to be able to do their job and not make it quite so simple. And that's really what we're going to talk about a little bit more here.
Absolutely. And I do think you're right. I think there's probably a lot of people paying ransoms that are just being, brushed under the carpet to try and prevent this and to move forward with their business operations. But rightly so, we are seeing a wave of new security legislation being rolled out globally. And that's from the EU's Cyber Resilience Act to the UK's PSTI. So Malcolm, can I ask you, what's the fundamental reason behind the regulatory push?
Yeah, of course, Ciara, thanks. When we think about how many IoT devices are now being manufactured, I've seen there's all sorts of numbers out there, but I looked at the latest number, 42 billion devices that are going to be in play by the end of this year, which is an absolutely massive number. And as Shawn just alluded to there, if you manage to create some kind of botnet in network effect from that network, you can effectively cause serious damage to ultimately consumers. And just to talk about legislation, that's effectively what the legislation is doing. It's trying to protect us as end users that are using these IoT devices. I always like to think about it. If you think about when we all started using Windows back in the day in the 1980s, whenever that was.
You're going back a bit there, Malcolm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we weren't thinking so much about Norton and all these great virus protection devices that we're all running today. When only today I've had several updates on my laptop where viruses are being we're being protected from viruses. With IoT, we need to stop. You need to stop that at the forefront of what the device is doing. And that's effectively what the legislation is all about. And of course, it's also protecting the manufacturers of these products as well. because, counterfeit, as Shawn mentioned earlier, is a major problem. And the more security you put in, then the less counterfeit products that you're going to have. The legislations, just think about what one of the first things in the legislation was about unique passwords, and it's a subject that we've all been extremely bad at in the past, and and there are IoT products that get delivered with a standard password that would be very predictable. But with this legislation in place, we're no longer able to do that, and that's a very good thing. But also, it gives a lot of challenges as well, because anything in manufacturing that's not standard or you need to create uniquely is not a simple thing to do. But luckily, companies like IAR have developed HSMs that can inject credentials like that uniquely into each device. So, as we'll talk about in a bit more detail.
Yeah. Okay. So these regulations certainly create new obligations for manufacturers, and at the same time, we're seeing the threats becoming increasingly sophisticated. We're not just talking about creation of unique passwords with the delivery of the IoT device. It's AI that's increasing the capability of hackers. So how is AI changing the threat landscape for embedded systems?
Yeah, AI is effectively a double-edged sword, Ciara. So, it's obviously a very, very powerful tool that we're all probably getting lots of great use out of. But of course, there's malicious actors out there that's getting just as good use out of it. It really ramps up the capability of what hackers can do. And if you think about how they could automate malicious attacks, it's multiplied by a fact. Well, goodness knows what the factor is, but it's certainly adding to the major risk, and it's also adding to the level. Somebody with a lot lower knowledge of cybersecurity can have a go at attacking an IoT device. So it's definitely a double-edged sword, and that we need to really start protecting against.
Absolutely. So we've both regulatory pressure and then the evolving threats, like Shawn mentioned earlier, along with AI pushing the whole security agenda forward. So in markets like consumer IoT, digital security does add costs in an already price-sensitive segment. So how can that additional investment be justified to the business stakeholders?
Yeah,
I'll ask that to you, Shawn, if that's okay.
Yeah. I was figuring that was kind of coming towards me. That's actually a really interesting question, because we do hear people talk about that, and there's several different ways that you can attack that question. Number one, I think we've all lived through the last 4 or 5 years where we've had incredible inflation on practically every good and service that we have. And it's just simply not viable to think that the prices of the goods and services that you're going to be providing to consumers won't also experience that kind of price inflation, simply because the parts and pieces that you're adding to it do add a little bit of expense. That as those parts go up on the bill of materials, therefore you have to either eat the cost yourself, or you have to consequently raise the cost. But the interesting thing is that adding security to your device really doesn't add that much cost. So when I say it doesn't add much cost, depending upon what you're doing, it could be, a matter of single cents. And while that does increase your bill of materials, you can effectively put that into other price increases that you have, and it becomes almost invisible to customers, because they more or less look at it as, I've seen the price of milk and gasoline, petrol continue to go up, so I'm not surprised that the price of everything else that we're doing seems to also be creeping up. But when you look at it from a more holistic perspective, What we have seen in the past, and not so much today, but we do still occasionally run into it today, is that people don't want to spend money on security, but then when their company's name is on the front pages of the news that, hey, you had this massive data breach and you leaked a bunch of personally identifiable information on your customers because you didn't even bother to follow even the most basic security protocols, then all of a sudden, no amount of money is too great to spend to try to make this problem go away. And as one of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So having a little bit of security up front can actually make many of these things go away and make it where it's a much smaller likelihood of happening. So it's partially around brand protection. You know, you've spent a lot of time, money, and energy creating your brand and finding your niche and creating value for your customers. And you don't want to damage that brand by the liability that you may have of leaking personal information. And one of the things that I've heard some customers try to hide behind is, well, we don't collect personally identifiable information. But I think modern research has shown that that's actually a failure of imagination. So databases have what are called a K factor, which is how many quote unquote anonymous databases do you need to have in conjunction with one another where you can effectively de-anonymize the data. And I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was one of the British prime ministers who had a database researcher that personally identified him and his family from a list of NHS supposedly anonymized databases that made him realize, oh my goodness, this really is a problem. There is no such thing as completely anonymized data, because when you combine it with other supposedly anonymized data, you can basically find out who each person is. So most databases have a K factor of, if I remember correctly, 2.7. So it takes on average 2.7 anonymized databases to identify 90% of the people that are inside of a supposedly no personally identifiable information database. So you have to get beyond the, well, it's not my problem. It is your problem. You have to address this. And the legislation, particularly the GDPR in Europe, makes you have to care about this. And you need to take measures to try to address this. And as we said, the great thing is that it's not overly onerous to deal with this. As I know we keep doing a lot of lead up here, but there are some simple and easy ways that you can address this, and it doesn't really cost you that much. So I'm going to leave that cliffhanger there for a second and so, see what other questions you have.
Yeah, for a relatively low cost, you are protecting yourself from the brand reputational damage. You're protecting your brand, and also ransomware attacks, not just the leaking of data, of consumers' data, but ransomware attacks are very costly liabilities that could be avoided.